Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Sit Around the Fire. Today, I am so thankful and grateful to be sitting down with Brian Sachetta, who is here to talk about all things mental health as we dive into a bunch of different topics, discussing some anxiety and depression and all kinds of things around this, and getting to know a little bit about who he is and his journey to where he is now. So welcome to the show, Brian.
Thanks, Ashley. Excited to be here. I think we're going to have a good combo.
Yes, absolutely. Anytime we get to talk about the brain and the nervous system, it's always a good conversation. So I'm definitely excited. Well, before we get into learning more about who you are, I always like to start with a question about, for the person who's listening to our chat today and listening to you specifically, what would you like them to walk away with knowing today, or the most impactful piece of information you want someone to hear?
Man, hitting, starting with the heavy hitters. Obviously I want folks to be able to take away actionable tactics from this conversation. But if there's one specific, what's the word I'm looking for? Through line, I'm pretty sure. It would be the idea, right? And I think this goes along with the theme of the podcast, is the idea that when it comes to mental health, specifically anxiety, often OCD, maybe a little bit of depression, but maybe not so much. Talking about anxiety and anxiety disorders, when we're dealing with those sorts of things, right, we go right into the nervous system. We're trying to figure out what's going on in the brain and in the body. And when you dig deeper, everything under there is saying the mind, the psyche, the body do not feel safe. And the difficulty is we can't always very easily identify why we don't feel safe. But once we do figure out why we don't feel safe and we address that thing, some of the anxiety, if not all of it, goes away. And the crazy thing is that those really hard ones to pinpoint where you're like, I don't know why I have anxiety, I don't know where this is coming from, the ones that feel random, when you figure out that safety piece, those go away too. So we'll talk about that for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, you're speaking all of my language, is figuring out the root cause of stuff is. And I'm big about not just treating the symptoms, because they're messages of the bigger problem. So we've got to look at what is actually going on and what's driving the anxiety, or really any emotion we're feeling. Awesome. Well, tell us a little bit about who you are and the story about what's got you to the here and now, and a little bit about the work you're doing.
Yeah, I appreciate the platform. So yeah, just to restate, I'm Brian Sachetta, owner and author of Get Out of Your Head, which is both a brand and a book series that seeks to help folks with anxiety and depression. All of my writing, all of my content comes out of personal experience. I started dealing with anxiety, struggling with anxiety really hard. I'd say age 17, but, it was probably a little bit before there. The signs were there, but sometimes, you get smacked across the face, if you will, and you're like, oh, maybe that's where it started. So I'm 35 now. Let's say that's been an 18-year journey. Along the way, I have essentially tried to ask myself and be honest with myself and say, where is the anxiety coming from? What could I do about it? What might help me? And my first book, the book I wrote about anxiety, was essentially 10 years of that experimental process, was saying, okay, I'm anxious in these kinds of situations, or I feel like I have generalized anxiety disorder, or I go to give a speech in front of, my classmates, and I feel really nervous and anxious before that. What's going on there? What could help? What might not help? And so over the course of 10 years, I tried out all these sorts of different tactics that I either thought of, somebody told me about, or I read in a book or a journal article. What I was trying to do was say, okay, which of these do I think work for me, and which of these work for people in general as I talk to them? And then I synthesized all that information down into a book that I thought would be approachable for folks by telling my own stories and, kind of weaving in those different tactics that I had learned. So the journey sort of keeps going in the sense that I took that same approach to a depressive battle that I had when I was 28, actually. And so that's like basically my whole brand, right? Is authenticity, going through struggles, trying to figure out the struggles. The one piece that, between you and I, or me and the listeners as well, I'd love to figure out, how do I get to a spot where I don't need to go through some crisis before I have the inspiration for a new book, if that makes sense.
Yes, I like it, but I also Well, I think all of us on this journey go through what I call the great dismantling, which is where it's within those crises or those challenging moments that we get so much more growth. And the information, like you mentioned, is like, okay, I don't want to go through another one of these, but look at what's come out of it. It's kind of such an incredible lesson. So I know it's hard when you're in the middle of it and it's hard to embrace the challenge, but yeah, all it's always for some kind of purpose.
Amen to that.
So I'm wondering, like, out of your, let's start with the experience with anxiety first. I think, and in my practice for sure, I can always, like, this is a guaranteed. Usually, I don't meet very many people, whether in my office or outside of my office, that aren't struggling with anxiety on some level, whether it's anxiety with what's happening in themselves or externally within the world. It's like there's just a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of fear. So I'm wondering if you can dive into and tell us a little bit more about within your own journey of this. You mentioned seeing this show up in some specific instances and circumstances, but in your journey of trying all these different things, what were some of the things that you tried and really grasped onto and was like, this is making a difference for me? This is something that's actually working.
It's a good question. I would say the real breakthroughs started to come probably around like the 8-year mark for me, which is why I felt so passionate about eventually writing about this stuff, because I thought to myself, 8 years, that is way too long. Like, why not accelerate that and try to be in a better place in a year, 2 years, whatever? That much suffering, that much struggling is kind of brutal. If I can be very honest, right? A lot of it wasn't that I hadn't been through a lot of anxiety already, but sometimes, you think about like leverage and just the situations that you get yourself into, almost sort of a thing where like an unstoppable force meets an immovable object kind of thing, or when the student is ready, the teacher will appear, in the sense that, like, yeah, I had gone through anxiety episodes and that sort of thing, of mostly social anxiety, dating, like I said, giving class presentations, going to job interviews. And those were frustrating and honestly pretty harrowing at times, but I think they weren't big and bad enough for me to really be honest with myself, crack myself open and be like, I really have to do the dirty work and I have to really figure out what is working here and what isn't working here. So the honest piece is like, it's not that I didn't try those first 8 years. It's not that I didn't experiment at all. I think I was starting from absolute zero, right? Like, if I look at my family, my household, right? Like, none of us are doctors. None of us have any innate experience with mental health. And so I went out into the world and was like, I'm 17 years old. I don't even know where to begin. And this is 2007, where the internet is essentially nascent at this point. There's really little information out there. Sure, you could go get a book on like cassette or CD, but there were no audiobooks. There were no podcasts. So that was challenging for me. It took me a while to essentially like find information that was helpful. And I think also is 2007, the world was very different. I went off to college and I'm a dude, like, dudes were probably a little different back then than they are today at the age of 17, right? We were the old rugged version of masculinity. And I'm not saying we were the epitome of it, but we certainly were more of the less helpful kind of like, oh no, I'm dealing with something, but I'm not going to admit it and I'm going to push it down, right? So for the first few years, I was really sort of in denial or battling myself. And it took me a while to eventually say, this is bad enough that I have to start doing some of these things. So, that process is starting in 2007, 2008. And then I'm, as I'm going through more struggles and more challenges, that those challenges are cracking me open and saying like, clearly you're not really, making enough progress here. Clearly you're not learning enough things. And so, I'd be reading books, I'd be reading journal articles, but like nothing really felt as though it was the answer and nothing really felt as though it was sticking. And I would say that like a lot of this process was a bit unconscious for me, in the sense that, yeah, I'm reading books, I'm listening to, whatever content I could find, even though it was pretty limited, and I'm going to therapy, but like I'm not connecting a ton of dots. I'm doing my best to just like put my head down and keep moving forward. And at some point, like dots started to connect because I had consumed enough information and I had started to figure some things out and test some things out. And so where I was kind of going with this story was I feel like it all came to a head in 2015. And this is where I'm honest, and it's honestly kind of messy, is, so I talked about how, my anxiety for a long time and still a little bit today, but I've gotten better with it, revolves around dating. And so I think back to like, why does, my anxiety revolve around dating, and why is that so important to me? We all care about our personal relationships. We all care about our intimate relationships. Importantly for me is, as soon as I started dating, essentially I saw these two women 6 months apart. I had no experience with dating. I'm super nervous. I'm super anxious. I go on these two separate dates or encounters or whatever, right? A hangout, and I have panic attacks on both of them. And neither of the women like responded to those panic attacks very well. So early on in my dating career, my brain is saying dating is painful, dating equals failure, dating equals panic attack. And so I'm wiring this subconsciously into my brain and into my psyche, and that's obviously not good. So, as I went through college, without really realizing it, I started to develop a bit of a crutch for alcohol, to be like, hey, if I have a couple beers, then I have liquid courage, and all of a sudden the anxiety goes away, and I don't have to think about this. I don't have to face my problems. They're just gone, And you can only do that for so long before the hangovers start to kick in, and you just feel bad about yourself, and you realize you're not really making any progress. The interesting or funny thing about this is I did this under the guise of socializing and just being a normal college dude, right? I was like, hey, I don't have a problem. I drink on Friday night. I drink on Saturday night, just like everybody else. I don't have a problem. I'm having fun, But when I look back, I'm like, the fact that I needed the alcohol, that was the problem in and of itself. If I just wanted to have a couple beers and have fun, that's a different story. But this was me doing a lot of masking. And so as I got into my mid-20s, I started saying to myself, look at the dating front. You're still not really in a serious relationship. You'd like to find one, but there's a lot of work to do here, and you haven't really started that work. And so in 2015, lo and behold, like I was out at a bar, I ran into an old classmate. We really hit it off and kind of started like a very, very brief relationship. And then she went on vacation. She quit her job and backpacked through Europe for a long time. And this was one of those moments where I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm super anxious. I have no experience with relationships and that sort of thing. I don't know how to really handle myself, conduct myself, as in like, how do I talk to her and be like, hey, I like you. You're gone for 3 months. What do we do about this? And all that, right? I'm holding a lot of these feelings inside, and I'm holding the anxiety inside of me saying to myself, I want this relationship to work out. And yet I'm really scared it's not going to work out, right? I'm going to have to, I can't be, I felt at that moment like I couldn't be honest about my mental health, my anxiety, that sort of thing. I didn't want to come off as clingy and, creepy or whatever. So essentially what happened was I got this trial by fire, if you will, where all those lessons that I had learned over the previous 8 years kind of came to a head. And I'm sitting there at work, at home for 3 months while this woman is, away on vacation. And I have to manage my anxiety because for one reason or another, I decided that this was the relationship I wanted to pursue, and I was going to see where it went. So I set the stakes a little bit too high for myself. I set the bar, or I set the stage for anxiety to emerge. And then given, my lack of understanding of mental health at the time, and also lack of experience on the relationship front, like I suffered quite a bit, right? Just running the different patterns in my mind, spinning the wheels of, what happens if she doesn't come back? What happens if she meets somebody else? All of those sorts of things. What happens if when she comes back, I have another panic attack in front of her, right? Just like I did with those other two women. And so that was really my moment of me having to figure this stuff out in real time. And once I did that, like, thinking about my experiences, trying out, because if it was 3 different months of experiencing this anxiety, right? I'm like, okay, it's day 25. Here we go. Like, we have to manage this anxiety. We have to figure this out. And so like the last 25 days didn't go so well. Let's try a new strategy today and see what happens. Now, let's fast forward all the way through. The relationship didn't really go anywhere. Kind of, ended poorly. And that's frustrating. It was unfortunate. But I look back and I say to myself, like, it's kind of one of those things where that's an experience that I needed at that time, right? That, like you said earlier, the difficulty, the pain, and all of that, that is part of the growth. And so I look back and I say, the silver lining is, by going through that, I did help myself with my own anxiety. And I also eventually wrote a book on all of those experiences I talked about, and that helped other people. So it was frustrating and challenging, but that was part of my journey as well. And now a lot of the work I do is talking about those different tactics that I lay out in that book in hopes of helping other people avoid, as much suffering as I feel as though I went through during that period.
Wow, yeah, there's like a million good things to take out of what you just said there, and so valuable. Of You mentioned suffering, which is of course one of my like most famous taglines as well, is on the mission to end the suffering, because we sit in these places of suffering for so long and um feel like that's just kind of normal. And kind of hearing you speak about this anxiety and about playing the what if games, I think everybody can relate to this. Everybody, just different like flavor of ice cream, right? Is whatever issue you want to pick. We all play the what if game when we're coming from that place of fear, and it can get so loud and so overwhelming that like it's no wonder why we feel like our body literally feels anxious. You don't even notice like our heart rate's increasing, our breathing rate, like the tension you feel, your stomach being all upset. It's like your body is communicating to you because your thoughts have communicated to the body, we're not safe, we're not okay. So I'm wondering like if we can dive into that a little bit more and explore this, is what happens to us, because I love to talk about this too from the physiological standpoint, is like what happens to our body when we're in those states of threat, whether it's fight or flight or freeze or fawn, whichever one we're talking about. But like let's dive into this and talk about this a little bit more, because I think it's important for us to recognize that those states are not normal homeostasis states. Those are threat, trauma, stress responses that your body is not designed to be in all of the time. So give me some of your thoughts, like of what your take on all this, because the people have heard me speak about it before, but tell me some of your things of like, what do you think about this, and what's your take on this safety and security and the threat response?
Yeah, I mean, this is the crux of all anxiety, as you're alluding to, right? So, where I like to start on this topic is thinking about the design of the body, human evolution, the course of history. So, let's just say a million years ago on the savannas of Africa, right? Our ancestors were running away from tigers, lions, scary predators. And so, over the course of evolution, or, like, whether you believe that our bodies were designed by God or they were shaped by evolution, it doesn't really matter, right? Because there's some point in time that we can go back to and say, this is what the body looked like a million years ago. And if you look at that body, right, it has pretty much the same brain and it has the same stress response inside of it. It has the same nervous system. The real difference and the real challenge with today's world is the fact that like the the stressors and the threats that we face are much different than that of the savannas of Africa. And I'm not necessarily saying that one is better than the other. I'm just saying they're very different. And what I mean by that is the acute stress response in the body was designed for exactly that, right? Acute stressors, not designed for chronic stressors. And so a depiction of that, or an illustration of that, is you think about an animal that's on the savanna of Africa, at the local watering hole drinking, and they're minding their own business, right? They're in homeostasis. And then out of nowhere, a predator comes up, and guess what happens? That acute stress response kicks on. And that animal's body and brain are saying, for the next 20 seconds, for the next 2 minutes, for the next 5 minutes, do whatever you have to do to get out of here. And so that's how the body is wired, right? Is to say, to get out of those immediate and really scary stressors or threats. You fast forward all the way through to today, and we look at the stressors that we face, right? And instead of them being predators that, come up to us, we run away from, and then we regain homeostasis, we are bombarded by chronic mild stressors everywhere we go. You think about, hey, I've got to pay my bills. I'm stuck in traffic. I have to talk to my boss. I don't like my boss. All these different things. You open Twitter, you see scary news headlines, whatever. Those are bombarding us on a regular basis. And so that acute stress response, which is designed for those acute stressors, has become hijacked a little bit, right? It's become hijacked by chronic stressors that are always with us. And so then when you think about, okay, why do we find ourselves anxious all the time, and why are rates of anxiety going up so much? I think you point right to that and you say, instead of facing a lion once a day, running away from it in 2 minutes and then going back to homeostasis, we're facing mini lions all the time, or proverbial lions all the time, right? And so our bodies eventually get to that spot where they are not in homeostasis for very long, assuming that we are, under the threat of these mini stressors. And some of them are actually pretty big, but it's challenging because we're dealing with hardware that wasn't built or designed for this kind of world. And so you take all of that and you say, all right, what do you do about that, right? Like, why not just throw my hands up and give up if that's the case? I guess what I would say is it becomes more important than ever to figure out regulation strategies for yourself and for your nervous system and implement those where possible, right? So it's all your stress reduction tactics. It's finding peace, taking a couple minutes out of your day to reset, that sort of thing. And the other piece here that's convenient, helpful, whatever, is thinking about, though, if we talked about, let's say, a zebra at that watering hole a million years ago, and, I might have my timelines wrong or whatever, but you think about, like, what strategies did they have at their disposal to come back to homeostasis? Essentially two main things. It's engaging the lungs and making sure you get oxygen in the lungs and breathe, and it's also moving the body, right? So inside of your body, inside of the acute stress response, right, or as part of the acute stress response, you're getting you're getting cortisol and you're getting adrenaline pumped into your veins, right? Those are chemical messengers that are saying, run for your life or fight this thing in front of you. And so if you're just sitting at your desk all day, every day, bombarded by stressors, essentially cortisol and adrenaline are just pumping through your bloodstream, telling you to do something, and yet, like, there's not really much that you can do, or you decide not to. And so those messengers eventually wear you all the way down. And so part of, building a toolkit for yourself to say, how do I manage anxiety and stress in the modern world, is to start with the basics, is to say, when I start to feel that stress, I need to bring my awareness and say, it's here. Okay, get up, move my body, do some deep breathing, that sort of thing. Once you do that, the science shows that you can sort of essentially like tap back into your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that's, responsible for emotional regulation and planning and critical thinking and that sort of thing. That part of your brain goes offline when you are hijacked. So the first step, right, is make sure you get away from that hijacking. Move your body, get air into your lungs, start deep breathing, and then when that PFC comes back online a little bit, then maybe you can say to yourself, okay, I know I have a couple more tactics that I could use here. Now that I have that awareness, let me bring that awareness to the table and use it for my own benefit.
Yeah, that's really great what you speak to of the toolkit and having some resources. Even today has been a long, busy, stressful day-ish for me. And I was literally before the podcast, I went outside, I put my feet in the grass, I did some tapping. That's one of my go-tos. And yeah, you just start to develop this framework around using your tools when you need to and regulate. And I like how you mentioned like being aware of what's going on. And I think this is a big problem that a lot of us fall into is we're not even really sure what we're feeling when it shows up, or people get really hung up on trying to label everything, which I'm like, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really need a label. Like it's your anxiety is different than my anxiety. Like it doesn't need this generic label to have it. It's you need to be aware of when it shows up, like an old friend. You know what it feels like, you know what it does, kind of like how it ends up working out, but you're very familiar with it overall. But I really appreciated what you said of like allowing it to be there and being aware of what the experience is and then doing something with it, like being able to use a tool or something that you have with it. Because so often we do what you mentioned before as well, is just push things down, suppress it. I don't want to feel this way. I don't want to feel anxiety. Everyone will raise their hand and say anxiety like feels pretty not pleasurable. Like I don't want to feel anxiety, but we push it down because we think that's going to work. That's going to make it better. So in your own experience, you mentioned this a little bit, but I'm wondering like what did you start to see in yourself when you were taking the suppression or the resistance tactic to your anxiety when it was showing up for you pretty heavily?
It definitely doesn't help, and it definitely doesn't work, right? If you keep pushing all this stuff down, it's sort of the trade-off of I don't know if I have the terms right on the tip of my tongue, but it's essentially like short-term versus long-term thinking, right? So in the short term, you say, I don't want to deal with this thing because it's painful, and so I'm going to shove it down. In the long run, you shove enough things down, those things are going to come out and they're going to be disgusting, and they're going to be really painful. An example that I would give of this, right, is if you are constantly, taking these things that make you anxious and you're avoiding them and you're pushing them down and whatnot, that is actually kind of like one of the stereotypical ways that OCD manifests, in the sense that what happens is you take all these issues you don't want to deal with, you push them down, and then you start engaging in behaviors unknowingly that are unhelpful. And what they're doing is they're trying to protect you further from addressing those things that you stuff down. And then essentially what happens is that solution becomes kind of the problem, if you will, right? So somebody who has OCD and is tapping all the time, and I don't mean this in terms of emotional freedom technique. I mean this in terms of checking doorknobs and ovens and garage doors and that sort of thing. That becomes a distraction for the brain to say like, hey, I still don't want to deal with these things that are brewing inside of me. Eventually, though, the problem is that those rituals take over your life. And then you look back and you're like, once you put the pieces together, you're like, oh my goodness, my life is run by these rituals that I picked up over time because I didn't want to deal with the scary things. And don't get me wrong, like going back to the idea of short-term versus long-term, dealing with scary things is terrifying. Nobody really wants to do that. And this is also where I kind of bring the idea of leverage back in, is until you see things laid out in a way that you can see that leverage, the odds that you change are not that great. Right? But when you say, oh my goodness, I built my whole life this way because I was trying to avoid this thing, and now the remedy is worse than the disease itself, all of a sudden you're like, now I have to change because I have leverage over myself.
Yeah, I like what you're saying there of like you have to be sick enough of your suffering essentially and have that willingness to do something about it. And it's interesting as you kind of talk about all the thoughts, and we spoke to this a minute ago as well, as playing that what if game and looking at how our conscious thoughts, our mind essentially is like the forerunner to the anxiety experience. And I think remembering that no thought just organically, or emotion, like anxiety, as we're talking specifically, just shows up organically. Like you mentioned, the gazelle that's at the watering hole, like he doesn't just instantly get flooded with adrenaline and cortisol for no reason. There has to be some kind of awareness around, like the lion just creeped in from the grass or whatever it is, and it's perpetuated by a thought and a realization of I'm not safe, I'm not okay. And then the mind takes over at that point, and then it's game on, because now we have all these thoughts that are saying, okay, what if this happens? Or I'm not okay, what about these bills? Or what are the kids doing? Or how's my marriage? Or like all the things. And it's really like the give a mouse a cookie tactic of like as soon as you like give that mouse one cookie, then we're off to the races. And now everything is like just fueling that anxiety fire, literally speaking anxiety to your cells of your body, which is so crazy, like cool how it is. But I just think it's so fascinating and so important to realize how powerful our minds are, and how our thoughts are a way that we co-create our own reality. So if you're constantly trapped in this anxious mind, like you're going to feel more and more anxious. What we put attention to grows bigger and bigger until, like you're saying, we've got to address it. We've got to use what we can to re-regulate our nervous systems and come back into homeostasis and ultimately deal with the ultimate reason of why the anxiety is showing up anyways. I'm curious on like cuz safety and security is such a big one, and definitely when we look at the energy in the way the body works is like we all know that our body operates off of energy, our brain, electricity, our heart, all those things. But can you give us some words of wisdom or thoughts around like this issue of security and safety and how that really does drive our mental thoughts and patterns, ultimately leading to anxiety?
It's funny because I'm trying to get out of the box that I've built for myself in the sense that that just seems so obvious to me that I'm having trouble breaking it down. I guess to repeat a little bit of what we've talked about before, right, is the acute stress response, the fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system, all essentially the same terms or same things, right? Those systems are designed to say, I detect a threat, therefore I don't feel safe, therefore, sound the alarms in the body. And that could mean many different things: a racing heart rate, sweaty palms, blood rushing to the extremities, the inability to think clearly, all of that stuff, right? So I would say essentially like lack of safety is pretty much a straight line to anxiety, if not uncertainty, and then anxiety comes from there. One of the most challenging things about anxiety, and something that you mentioned a minute ago, is it sometimes feels as though there's anxiety for no reason. But when you dig really, really deep, there's almost always a reason. Or at the very least, I'm one of those kinds of people that doesn't like to say, hey, you just have a completely, broken brain, broken nervous system, because I don't think that's really helpful for people. At the very least, if we were to say, hey, maybe you've gotten dysregulated over the years and we need to find ways to re-regulate your nervous system, that could be a longer term process. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to safety. It all comes back to emotional and nervous system regulation. If you can get back to that state of homeostasis and say, hey, brain, hey, body, like, here are the reasons to feel safe and to not feel panicked anymore, then that anxiety is not going to come up as much, or it's not going to come up at all. The one thing that I will say is, you talk to a neuroscientist, you look at some of the articles that are written about our thought activity. I believe they say that we have like 60,000 thoughts a day, and most of them are not unique. One of the things that's really helpful on the anxiety front and the OCD front as well is understanding that, unfortunately, sometimes like really scary, harrowing, intrusive thoughts can just pop into your mind for honestly no reason, or at the very least, like no good reason. And when you close around those thoughts and say, oh goodness, I'm not supposed to have that thought, that's scary, oh, that makes me a twisted person, that makes me an evil person, when you close your mind around that thought, you trap that thought, right? And then when you resist it by saying, I'm not supposed to have that thought, I'm not supposed to feel this way, you start building that anxiety in your body. And you really, again, you wrap around it, and that resistance creates more pain inside the body. The really interesting thing, because a lot of people will say like, take your thoughts captive, make sure that you weed out every bad one. Honestly, that might be the worst advice I've ever heard. And I hate to say it, but the real solution is actually super simple but hard, very hard. It's to look at the thought and say, well, yeah, guess what? I just saw a person walk across the train tracks and I thought, hey, what if I push them in front of the train? Yeah, horrible thought. You just let it go. You say, I don't know why that popped into my head. Doesn't make me a bad person. A lot of people have those thoughts. Actually, if I wanted to do that thing, that would make me a bad person. But I just had this thought. My brain came up with it. I let it go. And therefore, I also let go of the resistance, the pain, and the anxiety that I perpetuate by holding on to it.
Yeah, this is so good what you're speaking to, just being the conscious observer of what's going on. It's really hard. It's way harder than trying to hold your thoughts captive and change them, I will say. Just being aware, watching them pass by the window. It's tough, but so much better. Brian, what's your take on, as I hear you talking and I'm thinking about this, because it's one of my favorite things to discuss, is like secondary gains. So when we think about people and asking them, what do you get out of having your problem? Like, what do you get out of having your anxiety? What do you think, like, Or for you in your firsthand experience, like what are some of the things that you would have said, this is what I get out of having my anxiety, or you think other people would use that as a secondary gain?
Yeah, this is where I'll probably get a little controversial. Not too bad, but like you'll see where I'm going with this. Um, as soon as this topic comes up, the first thing that comes to mind is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The hierarchy essentially says that, we have these needs in our brains, in our bodies that we have to meet or we strive to meet in order to live a good life. And so I might miss one, but they are I'm just trying to pull them off the top of my head. They are physiological needs, so that's food, air, water, sleep, that sort of thing. Safety is the next one. Love and belonging. Self-esteem is number 4, and self-actualization is number 5. I think most of those are pretty clear. Self-esteem, right, is sort of like some sense of confidence, ability, competence, feeling as though we have certain abilities and whatnot. And then self-actualization is it's sort of this vague, often the distant one, sort of like become the best person that you can be sort of thing, or like live up to your potential. So Maslow essentially says like we strive to meet all of these needs in order to live a good life. And they are hierarchical in the sense that, most people are not going out and looking for self-esteem if they don't have any food and they don't have any water, right? So they sort of build upon one another, not necessarily like one-to-one, but like in general, you're not really pursuing the next one, at least consistently, if you don't have the one that comes before it. So I talk about in my first book, actually, and it's just funny because I'm like, it feels a little bit like a softball that you served me up, but I promise we did not talk about this in the pre-show.
We did it. We did it.
Yeah, so I talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs in my first book, and then I also like give my own take on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm definitely not going to get them all right here, but I essentially say like, hey, I think there's an argument to be made that Maslow's hierarchy could or should be updated. My take was essentially that like, if you think about like, what do we really need versus, I guess, let me put it this way, right? Is we all need air, water, food, sleep, that sort of thing in order to survive. After that, however, I think there's an argument to be made that you could realistically pursue any of the other ones in the order that you care about. And that is sort of what shapes your personality. And I would also say that the lower rungs on the hierarchy are more of the physiological and physical needs. And then when you get into the higher ones or just the ones above it, that's more the psychological needs, right? So that's, again, like love and belonging, self-expression, growth, contribution, things of that nature, right? And so I'm off the top of my head, I'm probably not going to be able to name all 7 or 8 of the ones that I lay out in the book. But what I would say is when you start to look at these different things, that's where you start to answer the question of what are the secondary gains of anxiety, right? So let me real quick see if I don't think I can name them all, but so physiological needs, and then I said security comes after that because let's face it, right? Like most of us are not running for our lives every day. We're looking for that sense of safety and security. And sometimes a lot of that is psychological, not necessarily physiological. I think I said love and belonging after that. And this is where I can't totally remember, but it's like, it's essentially certainty, uncertainty, growth. Geez, I can't remember the last 2, but again, the I think the overarching principle holds here, which is to say you can look at all these different needs that I lay out and you could theoretically try to say, hey, here's the rationale for why this person engages in this behavior, right? As in saying, even the behaviors that seem puzzling or as if they don't have an explanation, you look at the needs and you also look at the order in which a person has set their own hierarchy. And you could then say, okay, that makes sense. I understand why they do what they do. The other piece is my argument is we all, instead of like Maslow saying, hey, you have this hierarchy, it's sequential, but not everybody gets to level 5. I actually say that pretty much everybody does, as in everybody meets all of these needs to some degree. If you don't meet all the psychological ones to some degree, that is a breeding ground for mental illness. And also the way in which you try to meet the needs could potentially lend itself to anxiety, depression, addiction, that sort of thing, right? So if we think about anxiety and we say, okay, why does somebody engage in the things that they do? Why do they spin these thoughts around in their mind? Why do they go off into the distance and try to predict the future and that sort of thing? An argument that I would make, and this is where I'll probably start to remember a few more of the needs that I mapped out, is it's possible that two of the secondary gains are meeting these two needs, and they are a sense of importance and then also our need for certainty, right? So if you think about anxiety, the brain hates uncertainty. It wants to feel safe. It wants to feel at home. It wants to get to that state or that place of homeostasis. And so when uncertainty emerges, the brain is like, oh my goodness, what do we do? Possibly panic, figure out a way to get back to certainty and homeostasis. And in a sad and twisted way, a lot of the psychological research will show you is when you're spinning the wheels in your mind and you're trying to figure out things that are yet to happen in the future, that is your brain's twisted way of finding certainty, right? Those thought patterns that you're running, all the things that you're looping in your mind, I know it doesn't make total sense, but that's your brain's twisted way of having some sort of control over the situation, right? And so you are meeting your need for certainty, possibly, through those thought patterns that you run. And this is where I say it's a little more controversial, is I don't think anybody like really willingly says, hey, like I want anxiety, I'm doing this to feel important. I think it's more that we don't find a way to feel important otherwise. And then we fall back into anxiety and we're like, well, you wouldn't know, like I deal with anxiety all the time, right? And I know it's a little controversial. I'm not trying to ruffle feathers or make people mad. I'm saying that if you get that response from someone, which doesn't come that often, but if you get that response from them, that's an invitation to dig deeper, to say like, where did things go wrong, right? Where could you meet that need in more positive and uplifting fashions? It's not to knock the person down, it's to try to help lift them up, right? Because again, the brain is like this fascinating thing. And one of the most fascinating things about it is all of those needs, again, this is my theory, not Maslow's, but my theory is you have to meet all those needs on some level. The degree to which you do that in a healthy fashion determines whether or not you deal with some of these mental challenges, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very well said and well put together. And it makes me think of, I like to look at things from the subconscious and the conscious mind. So the conscious mind being the neurotic, chaotic mind that's receiving. I saw that article too, that 50,000 thoughts. And then I saw one the other day that they're saying now it's like 70 to 100,000, which I think it's like absolutely insane. That's a lot of thoughts. But the subconscious mind is that feeling, the belief, emotions, perceptions, all that kind of mind that sits within us. And we know when the subconscious mind doesn't feel good, the conscious mind is going to go into overdrive to try to make it feel better. So like you mentioned, like coming up with all of these ideas, and it's trying to do the best for us. It's not trying to cause us harm or more stress. It's literally saying, hey, I recognize like this, you feel terrible, this feels terrible. Let me try to find an outlet to make that feel better. And you kind of touched on, and I think it would be beneficial to highlight as well, as this idea around addictions or just behaviors in general. So like I look at this and I use myself as an example because it's the easiest, most real. And I feel like I need to because you used yourself as an example too. But like definitely when I get into that state of anxiety or stress or don't feel good is like, okay, where are all the carbs and where are all the sugar? Is like I need to be like invested into cookie, and being that it's cookie season right now, it doesn't help. But that's my go-to is like, okay, I can't fly to Mexico and go on a 1 week all-inclusive paid vacation right now. I can't, just lay in bed and do nothing. I can go eat 2 cookies and it'll make me feel a little bit better in the moment, but that's kind of that behavior, that addiction, that secondary gain, getting out of having the issue. But talk to me a little bit, or talk to us a little bit about this side with behaviors and addiction that we see show up with things like anxiety.
Yeah, definitely happy to talk about that. I did find the list of the needs that I wish I have memorized, but sadly I don't. So mine are physiological needs, security, love, novelty, expression, importance, growth, and impact. And I think we can make a good segue there, which is to say that, again, my take is the needs on that list that are more psychologically oriented. We have to meet all of those needs on some level. Otherwise, we're going to feel real, real bad. And even if we do meet all of those needs, if we meet them in a perverse way or a backwards way, that's where bad behaviors, addiction, that sort of thing can arise. And so I guess to give an example, right, is you think about, let's just say, something that is not necessarily like a chemically addictive, right? I don't think we should talk about cocaine because there's, that literally changes the structure of your brain can become dependent on it. But let's say something like, if you have, an addiction for, listening to podcasts, right? Which I'll put my hand up. I've definitely been there before. What I would say is like you look at this list of needs or some other list of psychological needs, and any time that behavior fulfills many of those needs, I would say probably on the order of like 3 or more, that's where you get into potential addiction territory. And the other piece is like there has to be an element of harm, right? In the sense that does that addiction make it such that it is preventing you from living the life that you want to? And I would even say, right, is I'm certainly not casting judgment upon you or any other listener, but if somebody said, hey, I'm addicted to baked goods, I'm addicted to sugar, right? They'd probably say that at some level, and, 1 cookie a day, that's a lot different than 12, And at 12, you're like, hey, this is not what I actually want to be doing. Sure, I like cookies, but like I also want to be able to say no to 12. That's not how I want to be showing up in my life every single day. So if we look at something like, listening to podcasts incessantly or eating too many cookies, that sort of thing, going through the list, right, is like, okay, let's skip physiological needs because that is not part of the psychological framework. But okay, so let's say I eat 12 cookies a day. Do I get security from that? Absolutely. I know that, I go there, I feel good, I feel warm, I taste everything, it's amazing. Maybe I go back to memories of growing up and I can smell the cookies, baking in the oven, that sort of thing. Do I get love? I'm going to say no, but I'm open to different interpretations here. Do I get novelty? I could, depending on, am I eating different kinds of cookies? Am I going to different bakeries? That sort of thing. But also, like, I'd say that's a borderline one. Am I expressing myself? I'd say no. Let's see what else. Do I feel important? Again, this could be more of the secondary gain kind of thing. I'm not 100% sure, but maybe it's like, hey, like, somebody talks to you and you're like, hey, you don't want to know what I'm going through. I'm like using these, I'm listening to podcasts or whatever in order to help myself with XYZ. And so then as we get that sense of importance as in like, you don't understand me or whatever, right? And again, I know this is tough and personal, and I'm trying my best to put the spotlight back on myself to be like, I do this too. And I'm like, yeah, like, so when I'm listening to my podcast, I'm like, look at me, like I'm learning all this cool stuff and I'm going to optimize my entire life and I'm smart. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh goodness, like I'm doing the thing again, Okay, so let's finish it out and just say growth. Yeah, 100%. I did switch from cookies to podcasts because I think it's maybe a little bit of an easier one to run out. But growth, yeah, like if I'm listening to all these personal development podcasts and I'm building my knowledge base, I'm like, hell yeah, I'm growing. I'm learning new things. I'm becoming a better person. I'm going to serve, my community or whatever, right? I'm going to be able to have better conversations with people and all that. And then impact. At the very least, like I'm not saying necessarily you jump from I listened to a podcast to I made an impact in the world, but I think you could give yourself the illusion that incessantly listening to podcasts is eventually going to make it such that you learn enough things that you create some impact in the world. And so again, like I know I switched from cookies to podcasts, but I look at this and I'm like, yeah, I can see why I got addicted to podcasts. Like, look at that. Yeah, when I go to listen to a podcast, I feel secure in knowing that I'm listening to my favorite podcaster. I'm learning something new. I know it's an hour long. I know I can fast forward through the commercials, all that sort of thing. So anything that, again, just to restate, anything that meets a lot of those different needs, probably 3 or more, and also brings in some element of harm in the sense that you're not living the life that you want to as a result of this behavior, that's my layperson's definition of addiction. And I think that's where it all comes together.
Yeah, I'm glad that you found the list because that's the last few are really important. And the common theme I hear you speaking of is control and thinking about where are the areas within all of those 8 categories that I can have some kind of control, which we know is the main culprit to anxiety, anyways, is feeling out of control, where you feel afraid, you feel fear, and then we do whatever we need to do to feel that safety and security as so much as going down the OCD route, which is for sure trying to have control over things within your environment or things that you're doing. And then we see the addiction piece come in because now I really think I can have control and I'm trying to make some kind of positive impact in the way that I'm feeling. So it's really like it always like connects back together and it always makes so much sense. But it's this deep innate feeling that we're like totally out of control, like totally not okay, essentially. So as we kind of start to come towards the end of our conversation, I wonder if you could give us your take on when, you kind of fast forward through your journey, but when you got to the point where you decided to just surrender, to just kind of let go and to essentially like pull your paddle into the boat and just float down the river. It's like, tell us about that experience for you.
That's a good question. I think the first time I ever really felt like that was when I was going through my depressive episode in 2018. I think that, for folks who, and I mean, both conditions are brutal. I'm not even trying to compare them. All I'm saying is like for folks who've been through a depressive battle, like that knocks you on your butt and turns your world upside down and you have no idea what to think, who to be, who you are anymore, how to look at the world. Like you are just either the saddest you've ever been for as long as you can remember, or you feel nothing at all. And neither of those options is a good one. And I remember talking to a friend and he was like, Brian, like, okay, so you're going through this depressive battle and you said, you want to eventually learn something from this battle, write a book about it and, help other people that are going through depressive episodes. Why did you choose this path? And I kind of laughed and I was like, he wasn't trying to be dismissive. I was just like, dude, I did not choose this path. This path chose me, or whatever term you want to put on it. I am powerless here in the sense of like, sure, I can do things about going through depression, but I can't change the fact that this is where, the stars aligned and led me to. And so that was really a moment where I was like, okay, crap, maybe I don't have it all figured out. Maybe I don't really know. Not necessarily I don't know what I'm talking about, but maybe I have a long way to go. And part of what was tied up in part of that was the depressive battle actually hit right before I published my first book. And, I was 28 at that time. I still think I was a bit of a kid, to be honest. I remember like being close to finishing that book and thinking to myself, here we go, like I figured out all this anxiety stuff and I have mental health, like I understand it all and I'm a know-it-all kind of thing. And I look back and I'm like, geez, buddy, like you had a lot to learn, And so it was really this, I don't know, come to Jesus moment or just this reckoning of like me having to surrender and say, you know what? I admit that I don't know it all. I admit that this thing has me, by the tail and I don't know how to get out of it. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes that surrender can be helpful in the sense that when you stop resisting against it, you start to find other solutions and you start, or I guess you stop, that resistance that you create also creates and perpetuates a lot of your pain. And so when you stop resisting, sometimes that pain mutes itself a little bit. So that was definitely, that was a transformative time in my life. I certainly wouldn't want to go through it again. And I don't even look at it like rosy-eyed, like that was so brutal. But at the same time, I look back and I'm like, it was part of my path. It brought me to different parts of where I am today. It eventually became part of my brand and my book series as well. And so like, again, I guess my thing is like trying to find the silver linings in the suffering and then take those silver linings and share them with people and help them. And so being able to connect that dot or those dots and say like, hey, this is real bad. This is as bad as it's ever been, but I'm going to try to find some way to connect those dots again and help people. That was like the only thing that really got me through.
Yeah, I hear that like mission coming out of all of that for you. Like there's a reason. And now you have this really amazing platform to stand on to just have these powerful conversations around mental health in general, but be very real and transparent about this was your story. And I think that's the most impactful thing we can do for one another is share the stories and find that commonality piece within all of our stories. And we all experience this. Like there's not, we talked about this before, but there's not a human being that has never experienced anxiety or depression. And like having that commonality in the experience is so valuable. So
It
awesome.
really is. And I think it helps us remove some of the resistance as well, right? When we realize that these things are common, not necessarily easy and not necessarily everyday occurrences, but when we realize that other people go through them as well, we allow ourselves to take some of that stigma away, right? To say, I'm not the only person on earth who's dealt with this thing. I'm not weird or strange or abnormal as a result of dealing with these things. These are part of the human condition. And the more that I embrace that and the more that I lean into it, probably the better I'm going to feel, the less resistance I'm going to feel, and the less of this suffering I'm going to perpetuate for myself.
Yeah, that was like the perfect thing to end on. So I'm not even going to say anything else because that was awesome. Well, it's been such an amazing pleasure to sit down and talk with you and just dialogue and have these important conversations again, like we said. And I know everyone listening is going to take away so much from this conversation. And the biggest thing I think both you and I would agree on is knowing you're not alone going through this. And there are so many resources and people out there and things you can do to help you through this. But I want to make sure we get you set up with all of the things. So we'll make sure that your links to your book are in the show notes and people can connect with you and kind of support all the work that you're doing. But any last thoughts or any nuggets you want to give to the listeners before we sign off?
I bet you could guess where it's going. It's essentially what you said, a message of solidarity, a message of love. Going through these things is so hard. There is no doubt about it. Just know that, you're not alone. There's people you can talk to. Things will get better. It takes time, but they can get better, and they probably will. So keep pressing on, keep holding on to hope, and my heart goes out to those folks who are struggling.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Brian, and we look forward to having you on the show again. Like, we got to continue the conversation. So thank you so much for coming on and taking the time today.
Thanks, Ashley.
Before we wrap up this episode today, I just want to say a very special thank you. Thank you for spending this time with us today. If today's episode brought you value, if it helped you see something differently, or even it just made you feel a little more connected, please take a second to like and subscribe. It really does help us reach more people who need these conversations in their lives. We'd also really, really love to hear from you. If you drop us a comment, leave us a review, or send us some of your feedback. Tell us what resonated, what you want more of, or what topics you'd like for us to cover next. And if you know someone who would benefit from this episode, share it with them. That one share can make a huge impact, so much bigger than you may even realize. Don't forget, you can also check us out on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel for full video episodes and even more exclusive content you won't find anywhere else. So if you like seeing the conversations and not just hearing them, that's the place to be. Thanks again for being here, everyone, for supporting the show, and for being a part of this community. I can't wait to see you again in the next episode.